All right, gang, what is up? Today is day 13 of PR 30, and today we are going to be talking about the twin streams of Athens and Jerusalem that runs through the modern Western man. Specifically, I wanted to talk about what I like to write about, or what I find myself writing about more and more. The inspiration behind my first book, This Way to the Stars, An Introduction to Philosophy, was because I found myself with a very deep interest in Stoicism, but also in ancient Greek philosophy of Plato and Aristotle and Heraclitus, and because of Plato, Socrates is the character in Plato. And then when I went to law school, it turns out that the study of law, is as much philosophy as it is interpreting law and code and applying law. Because when we study sort of our founders and the founding and the Federalist documents, what we find is our founders themselves were very much students of ancient Greek and Rome. Specifically, you have Plato's Republic. You have a lot of the work of Cicero. Cicero was known as kind of the best Roman orator. If you've ever seen any of the movies about Winston Churchill, it's kind of well known that Churchill admired Cicero a great deal and quoted Cicero often. And then it's Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws. It's John Locke's. It's John Locke. It's John Stuart Mill. It's all those guys. And so very quickly, when you start to study where law came from, you're also getting an education in philosophy. With all this working as the background for me, I practiced law for 5 years, and then when I moved to Austin, I became really interested in writing. And it was as I dug more and more into it, it was starting to. And I was also, as an aside, I was also raised in a Christian home, so I had went to Sunday school every Sunday. So I had this background knowledge of sort of the biblical tradition, what I'm referring to as Jerusalem, and then a very keen interest in the Athens tradition. And when I say Athens tradition, that kind of it includes Rome, because the more and more we learn about Rome and Roman culture, it wasn't exactly a copy and paste of Greek culture, but effectively, for all intents and purposes, Rome sort of absorbed the culture of Greece. They absorbed the gods, just gave them different names. So um, it's the difference between Jupiter and Zeus. Jupiter is the Roman version of Zeus. Um, there are every Greek god has a Roman equivalent, and many of the schools, like Stoicism, for instance, are sort of offshoots. Alfred North Whitehead would say that all philosophy is a footnote to Plato, and that's not that far off. And so when Romans, you have the Stoics. Stoics consider themselves sort of students fundamentally of Socrates, and the idea that virtue alone is enough is sort of the foundational fundamental tenet of Stoicism. But so with all of these interests working inside of me, what I came to be fascinated by was how these twin rivers and the intermingling of them, sort of the braiding of them, is what makes up the fabric of our DNA as the modern Western man. And I became obsessed with the idea of exploring our origins, in an exercise to try and know myself and examine my life. I realized that our origin stories, our individual origin stories, have origin stories. In order to understand who we are as a person and as a people, we have to understand where we came from, and we have to understand the stories and philosophies and ways of viewing the world that our ancestors had and our ancestors before them. And you have to go as far back to the beginning as you possibly can. And in order to do that, you have to start with the earliest forms of literature and things written down. And so that's Mesopotamia and it's Egypt. And you start to trace the lineage of these ideas and the history of these ideas and the philosophies and the mythology. So this is where my second book is a history of the hero, but it's effectively an introduction to mythology, which tries to trace the development of the stories that make us who we are, both of the Greek heroes and Greek mythologies, and those from the Hebrew and biblical tradition, up through the Middle Ages. In the first book, I do that with philosophy and look at ideas from Egypt and Mesopotamia, and then Greek, Rome, Middle Ages, modern man. I do that with philosophical ideas in the first book, and I do that with mythological hero stories in the second book. So what you start to see with everything I'm working at is this exploration of how these two streams overlap, work together, feed off each other, tell a similar story. Growing up, I was told and I was made to believe that there was a irreconcilable difference between these two traditions. But as I've matured in my thinking and in my writing, I've come to view it as they're actually largely complementary of each other. And the fact that they often sing the same song or tell similar stories is expressive of a fact that they are both trying to seek and get at some objective truth. When they come to similar conclusions, and this actually is, whether it's Athens, Jerusalem, or China, Chinese, Japanese, any of the Eastern religions and cultures, there are examples of what C.S. Lewis called the Tao. He called it the Tao and the abolition of man, and it was expressive of this idea that there are certain principles that recur throughout cultures, traditions, and religions that express something true about the nature of the universe. The fact that all of these different religions and cultures, probably disconnected from each other, come to independently to a similar conclusion about a fundamental part of reality or a tenet is the best tool we have for trying to discern what really is true about the world, the set of moral laws. Cicero would call it natural law. That is the law that sort of transcends any one culture or time period. And so we have this idea of the Tao. We could think about this. Probably the best example of it is something like the Golden Rule, or do as you would be done by. Confucius had sayings that were effectively the same. It's biblical. We also get it in the Greek tradition, and so that's one example of something that C.S. Lewis would say fits squarely within the Tao. That is, in the way of the world. The way that C.S. Lewis describes the Tao is both the way the world works and the way which we must tread in imitation of that great exemplar if we are to flourish in it. This is the reason my third book, which is something like the synthesis and culmination of my first two, is called A Tao Beyond Time, or A Tao Beyond Time. Because what I'm fundamentally trying to do is look across, scour the ruins of Athens and Jerusalem, you could say, to discern the fundamental nature of reality in the world and how to flourish within the context of these rules. So I call it A Tao Beyond Time because I'm trying as much as possible to outline and explore the way the world works from a perspective of sort of objective reality, and then the way which we must operate in it if we are to flourish. That's fundamentally at its most core level what the third book is about. And I had to write the first two, which is something like the origins of Athens and Jerusalem and the worlds of philosophy and mythology, in order to be able to even attempt to write this third one. And it's still going to be woefully inadequate and fall short of anything like an authoritative guide. It is at best my attempt at coming up with something like a guidebook for life, given my current experience on everything from my current point of view that I believe is worthy of remembering. I think the other thing I'm passionate about, and the reason I started my Substack, the Lumenorean, the idea of the Lumenorean is a character concept that came to me that is something like the cosmic librarian of Atlantis and Hand of God, who is tasked and asked to help the world remember wisdom when it's lost, help the world recover the worthy things that sometimes are, that sometimes are forgotten. It's the eternal flame becoming an ember. And the Lumenorean is this character who inserts himself into the eternal historic timeline at strategic points in history to remind the world of something it has forgotten. And when I'm talking about the Lumenorean's job is reminding the world of something it has forgotten, what I'm talking about is the transcendentals, which is truth, beauty, and goodness. So it's pointing the world's attention back to the true, the beautiful, and the good. And in order to do that, there is an exploration of our origins. It's looking back at there's a line about the reverence of tradition. This is going to get it a little bit wrong, but it's the reverence of tradition is not the worship of. I'm gonna get it. I gotta look it up. I don't want to mess this up. Is not the worship of ashes. Okay, so the quote is: "Tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire." That's the quote. Tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. That is the project I am attempting to do. In my description of the Lumenorean, I said preserving the fire, covering the classics, because I think fundamentally, if we think about this idea of C.S. Lewis had a book called The Abolition of Man, and he thought we'd created a society of men without chests. And part of the reason he thought we'd created men without chests is because we've lost touch with our cultures and traditions, and something like the classics, the literature, and we've lost touch with what Aristotle called it, the excellence long labored for by man. And there was a slow march, an attempt in seeking of what was true, what was good, what was beautiful. And that slowly gave us the shape of how do we define excellence, goodness, truth, what is right and wrong. And by disconnecting ourselves from our cultures and those literary traditions, what we are doing is we're actually disconnecting ourselves from our roots. And if we're disconnected from our roots, like a tree, we wither, we can't flourish. There's an article that I really love, titled Athens and Jerusalem, written by this guy named Leo Strauss. And I'm going to read part of my favorite part of it, and it goes like this: "Yet our intention to speak of Jerusalem and Athens seems to compel us to go beyond the self-understanding of either. Or is there a notion, a word that points to the highest that both the Bible and the greatest works of the Greeks claim to convey? There is such a word: wisdom. Not only the Greek philosophers, but the Greek poets as well were considered to be wise men. And the Torah is said in the Torah to be your wisdom in the eyes of nations. We then must try to understand the difference between biblical wisdom and Greek wisdom." Fundamentally, that's the project I'm engaged in. And looking at the Greek myths, the Greek plays, the Greek philosophers, and then also simultaneously looking at the biblical stories, the biblical precepts. I'm doing my best to synthesize, draw distinctions between, and discern something like a bridge or a collective wisdom that we can glean from both of these things, not only to understand who we are and the mysteries of the energies that run through us, but to understand how we might best move forward into the future, bringing the best of the past, what's worthy from the past, and giving it sort of safe passage with us into the future. There's another line by Gandalf, and I the Gandalf's line is effectively, I want to try to look it up, but I'm gonna try to say it from memory, and it's effectively, I shall not have failed wholly of my task, if anything which is worthy shall have made it through this dark night. Is somebody named Noah? I also like to think about it symbolically as this idea of Noah's the one tasked with bringing the old world into the new world, the life-giving things, each of the animals, 2 by 2, in this ark, takes them through the flood so they can start a new world. And I'm symbolically, my namesake then, I think part of that to me speaks to this idea of what I'm trying to do is do that same thing but with ideas. How do I make sure that I am playing my role, doing my part to preserve all of the worthy things in the past that are necessary to bring a flourishing life in the future and pass it down to our generations? So when I think about the great project of my life, what I'm trying to do with these videos and my writing and my books is something exactly like what I've been talking about in this entire video, is a preservation of the fire by a remembrance of our origin story in our heritage, so that in remembering our heritage, we remember who we are as humans and what we're capable of being and what we're meant to do. And so instead of disconnecting ourselves from our ancestry, I believe it is the job and the task of the modern philosopher to restore us to the vitality of our roots, because only the rooted can grow tall. That's what I'm after. That's enough for today's rant and today's video. Thank you for allowing me to go off on a tangent about the things I am passionate about. If this is of interest to you, I would love to know what things you are reading, what projects you're working on, or if you'd like to work together in some capacity. But until next time, I'm out. Peace.